Open this gate, Elowen. Stop embarrassing yourself and step aside. Maribel and I are staying here, whether you accept it or not.
My husband brought his mistress to my lake house, so I locked the doors and stopped them at the gate. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from and share your country or city in the comments. Do you agree with her decision to protect her home and set a firm boundary, or should she have handled the confrontation differently? Please keep the discussion respectful. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay until the end. Your support helps us keep creating heartfelt stories about dignity, justice, healing, and quiet strength. Do not make this difficult alone. Maribel and I need the house for the weekend. The message arrived while Aloan Hartwell was closing the last cedar shutter against the cold October wind. Outside, Seneca Lake lay flat and gray beneath a bruised evening sky, and red maple leaves moved across the stone terrace in slow circles. She read Graham's words once, then looked toward the security monitor beside the pantry door. His black sport utility vehicle had just turned onto the private road. Maribel Sloan sat beside him in a cream coat, one hand resting on a designer bag. 2 leather suitcases were strapped behind them, along with white flowers and 2 cases of wine. Aloan did not feel surprise. Surprise belonged to people who had not spent 3 weeks watching pieces fall into place. She crossed the quiet kitchen and stopped beside the old brass key her mother had once carried on a faded blue ribbon. The house still smelled faintly of cedar, coffee, and the lemon oil Tamsin used on the dining table. Every room held something Graham had learned to call ours. The dock he photographed for clients. The stone fireplace he stood beside during holiday parties. The guest suite he promised Maribel would have the best view. Aloan picked up the gate control instead. On the monitor, Graham slowed at the curve, confident enough not to call first. He reached the keypad and entered the same 6 numbers he had used for 17 years. A red light appeared. He tried again. Red. Maribel turned toward him, her expression changing from expectation to confusion. Graham struck the call button. The intercom chimed through the house. Aloan waited until the second chime before answering. "Open the gate," he said. No greeting. No explanation. His voice carried the impatience of a man delayed at an entrance he believed belonged to him. Aloan stood near the window, where she could see the iron bars rising between the driveway and the lake house grounds. "You were notified that your access had been revoked." Silence followed, brief and sharp. "I did not agree to that." "You were not asked to agree." Maribel stepped out of the vehicle and looked toward the house. Graham remained behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel with one hand. "Do not start this tonight," he said. "We are tired, and I already told Maribel we would be staying here." Aloan's fingers rested against the brass key. Her mother had bought the property after 32 years of work and placed it in a private trust before illness took away the strength in her hands. Never let anyone make you feel like a guest in the place that saved you. Aloan had remembered the words for years without fully understanding them. Now Graham was outside the gate with another woman and luggage for a life he had planned inside her mother's house. "You told her wrong," Aloan said. Graham opened his door and stepped onto the gravel. The autumn wind caught the edge of his overcoat as he walked toward the keypad. "Aloan, stop behaving like this is some private kingdom. I am your husband." She looked at the red light above the locked mechanism. "That never made you the owner." His face tightened on the monitor. Maribel stared at him, waiting for the easy explanation he had probably promised. Graham entered the code a 3rd time. Read again. Then his phone lit in his hand with the legal notice he had ignored that morning. Aloan placed the gate control on the table, picked up the brass key, and watched the 2 of them stand outside as the lake house windows glowed warmly behind her. The legal notice glowed on Graham's phone while the wind moved dry leaves around his shoes. He read the first line, then looked toward the house as though Aloan had personally altered the meaning of every word. Maribel remained beside the vehicle with one hand on the open passenger door. Her cream coat was too light for the cold, and the confidence she had carried up the driveway had begun to thin. "What is that?" she asked. Graham locked his screen. "Nothing final." He pressed the intercom again. Inside the house, Aloan watched from the entry hall beneath the brass pendant her mother had chosen 20 years earlier. The old key rested in her palm, warm from her hand. Graham's voice came through the speaker, lower now. "Open the gate, Aloan. Stop embarrassing yourself and step aside. Maribel and I are staying here, whether you accept it or not. For one moment, the house seemed to remember every time she had opened the door before he reached it. Winter nights when his flights landed late. Summer weekends when clients arrived before sunrise. Holidays when he brought guests without asking and expected the rooms to be ready. Eloan had called it generosity. Graham had learned to call it access. "You received notice this morning," she said. "Your code, keys, and guest privileges were revoked. You cannot revoke my rights because you are angry. These are not your rights." He laughed once, without humor. "You are not my wife anymore, Eloan. We both know this marriage has been finished for months. So stop pretending this place belongs only to you." The sentence reached her through the speaker with almost no emotion, as though 17 years could be reduced to a scheduling inconvenience. Eloan lowered her gaze to the key. Her mother's initials were worn into the leather tag. "It does belong only to me," she said. Silence followed. Maribel stepped closer to Graham. "You said this was part of the marital estate." He turned away from the intercom. "It is. She is upset." "Then why is there a legal notice?" "Because she enjoys making everything dramatic." Eloan heard every word. The security system carried sound clearly across the stone pillars. She did not correct him for Maribel's benefit. She had spent too many years explaining Graham's behavior in gentler language than it deserved. Graham returned to the speaker. "Unlock it now, or I will have Tamsin do it. Tamsin works for the Hartwell Trust. She manages the property." "For me." The answer was quiet, but Maribel's expression changed. She looked past the gate toward the glowing windows, then at the suitcases Graham had packed for both of them. "Graham," she said, "did you tell her we were coming?" He ignored the question. "This is ridiculous. I have hosted investors here. I have paid for repairs. I have maintained this place." Eloan looked around the entry hall. The walnut floor had been restored with money from her mother's trust. The slate roof had been replaced through an account Graham had never seen. Even the wine cellar he bragged about had been built from a settlement Odessa Hartwell had protected before her death. Graham had paid for a grill once and called it an improvement. "You used the house," Eloan said. "That is not the same as owning it." His hand closed around the iron bar. "I am your husband, not according to the sentence you just used." He stared toward the camera, realizing too late that she had heard the contradiction. Maribel folded her arms against the cold. "Can we go somewhere else tonight?" she asked. Graham did not answer her. He looked at the locked gate as if persistence could turn metal into permission. Then another notification appeared on his phone. This time it was from Dorian Kells, trustee counsel for the Hartwell estate. The subject line read unauthorized entry and misrepresentation of property rights. Eloan watched Graham open it. His face changed before he reached the second paragraph. The second paragraph did not mention the affair. It mentioned ownership. Graham stood beneath the security light with the phone angled toward his chest, reading that Hartwell Lake House had never entered the marital estate, had never been pledged to any joint account, and could not be accessed, transferred, or represented without written authorization from Eloan and the Trust Council. Maribel watched his face instead of the screen. "What does it say?" she asked. Graham locked the phone again. "It is legal language. Dorian always overstates things." But the house behind Eloan had heard that confidence before. 17 years earlier, Graham had first arrived there in a rented sedan with 2 boxes of tools and a smile that made unfinished rooms seem temporary. The roof leaked above the eastern hallway. The dock leaned toward the water. Half the windows had been painted shut by years of neglect. Eloan had stood in the kitchen with rolled plans under one arm and told him she intended to restore everything her mother had protected. Graham had walked through the room slowly, touching the cedar beams and looking toward the lake as if the property had already begun improving his future. "We could make this ours," he had said. Eloan had smiled because she heard partnership in the word. She did not yet hear possession. During the first summer, she used trust funds to replace the roof and reinforce the dock. Graham helped choose fixtures and spent weekends sanding cabinet doors. He worked just enough to make the house feel shared, then began speaking about it as if effort had rewritten ownership. At dinner parties, he called it the place he had saved from ruin. With clients, he called it his private lake property. When friends complimented the stone terrace, he told them he had designed it. Eloan corrected the details at first. Then she stopped. The corrections made Graham defensive, and she had mistaken peace for generosity. Over time, his company began using the house for private retreats. Investors drank bourbon beside Odessa Hartwell's fireplace. Marketing teams photographed the dock at sunrise. Graham hosted men whose names Aloan only learned after they had slept in her guest rooms. He never asked whether the dates suited her. He told her when people were coming and expected the sheets pressed, the kitchen stocked, the grounds perfect. When she objected, he kissed her forehead and said, "It is good for both of us." The phrase became a key he used more often than the one in his pocket. By the 10th year, he had stopped calling before arriving. By the 12th, he introduced Aloan as the person who handled the house, not the woman who owned it. She had heard the distinction and chosen not to disturb the room. Now, from behind the locked gate, Graham was still speaking from the story she had allowed him to tell. "I paid for repairs," he repeated into the intercom. Aloan looked toward the slate roof, the restored windows, the dock lights reflecting on the lake. Every invoice existed. Every transfer came from the trust. "You contributed labor 17 years ago," she said. "You have been compensated in access ever since." Maribel turned toward him. "You told me you bought this place before the marriage." Graham's eyes moved quickly to her. "That is not what I said. You said it was yours. It is complicated." The words carried across the speaker, thin in the cold air. Aloan placed the old brass key on the entry table beneath her mother's photograph. In the picture, Odessa stood beside the unfinished porch with one hand resting on a wooden post, her face tired but certain. Behind the glass, she seemed to be waiting for Aloan to remember something important. Love could make room for someone. It did not have to surrender the walls. Outside, Graham tried the keypad once more. The red light returned. This time, Maribel did not look surprised. She looked at him as if the gate had begun opening in a different direction. Maribel's expression stayed with Aloan long after the security monitor dimmed. It was not anger. It was the slow discomfort of someone realizing she had been invited into a story with missing pages. Graham remained outside the gate, pacing between the keypad and the sport utility vehicle, but Aloan's attention drifted toward the framed photograph of her mother. Odessa Hartwell had been 58 when she bought the lake property, after 32 years of managing other people's homes, schedules, and emergencies. She had learned early that security built on someone else's promises could disappear without warning. Her first marriage had ended with bills she had never signed and accounts emptied in her name. She never spoke about it with bitterness. She simply changed the architecture of her life. By the time Aloan was 16, Odessa had saved enough for a narrow parcel beside Seneca Lake, 6 acres of wind-bent maples, uneven stone, and a neglected house with more leaks than working windows. She drove there every Sunday in an old blue sedan, carrying paint samples, receipts, and sandwiches, wrapped in wax paper. Aloan remembered sitting beside her on the unfinished porch while Odessa studied the lake. "A home should not make you grateful for permission," she had said. At the time, Aloan thought she meant rent. Years later, after Odessa's health began failing, Dorian Kells came to the house with a leather folder and explained the trust. The property could not become marital collateral. It could not be transferred through assumption, convenience, or pressure. No spouse could claim access simply because Aloan loved them. Odessa had added every restriction herself. Graham attended that meeting. He sat beside Aloan, held her hand, and said the protections were unnecessary because he would never touch what belonged to her family. Dorian still required his acknowledgement. Graham signed without reading beyond the first page. After Odessa died, Aloan returned to the lake house alone and found her mother's brass key in a ceramic bowl beside the entry. A small note was folded beneath it. "Never let anyone make you feel like a guest in the place that saved you." Aloan kept the key, but she did not keep the boundary. She gave Graham a code, a remote, keys for his assistants, and permission to treat the property as an extension of his business. Each concession looked small when made alone. Together, they taught him the wrong lesson. Outside, the intercom sounded again. Graham's voice came through sharper than before. "Dorian has no authority to interfere in my marriage." Aloan looked at the trust document displayed on the tablet beside her. "He is not interfering in the marriage. He is protecting the property. From me. From unauthorized use." Graham gave a short laugh. "Your mother filled your head with fear." The words settled across the entry hall. Aloan did not answer immediately. She could see Odessa in the old photograph, standing in work gloves beside a porch column she had sanded herself. Fear had not bought this house. Discipline had. Memory had. The refusal to lose everything twice had. My mother gave me clarity, Aaliyah said. I ignored it for too long. Maribel had moved farther from Graham now, close to the vehicle, arms folded against the wind. What exactly did you sign? She asked him. He turned toward her. Nothing that matters tonight. Then why can you not open the gate? Graham looked back at the house. The warm windows reflected in the dark lake behind Aaliyah. For years, he had mistaken light for welcome. Because she is being vindictive, he said. Aaliyah picked up the brass key and closed her fingers around it. No, she replied through the intercom. Because this is the first time I am following the rules my mother wrote to protect me. The red light above the keypad remained steady. Then Dorian's name appeared on the security monitor, connected to the outer camera from a vehicle approaching the private road. Dorian's sedan appeared at the bend with its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Graham stopped pacing when he recognized it. Maribel looked from the approaching car to the locked gate, then back at the man who had promised her a quiet weekend in a house he called his. Aaliyah remained inside the entry hall, one hand resting beside the intercom. 3 weeks earlier, Dorian had called her from his office in Rochester and asked a question that sounded ordinary until she heard the caution beneath it. Did you authorize an appraisal of Hartwell Lake House? Aaliyah had been standing in her kitchen in Manhattan, sorting mail Graham had left unopened. No, Dorian sent the document while they were still on the phone. The appraisal contained aerial photographs of the property, estimated values for the house, shoreline, dock, and 6 acres, and a notation identifying it as marital real estate available to support a commercial financing package. At the bottom was a signature that resembled hers from a distance. Up close, the final letters leaned the wrong way. The filing belonged to Silver Pines, Graham's $74 million resort development in the Catskills. Aaliyah read the pages twice before opening the calendar they shared through his assistant. On the date the appraisal had been ordered, Graham claimed he was meeting lenders in Boston. A hotel receipt from that same evening carried 2 breakfast charges and Maribel Sloane's rewards number. Aaliyah did not call him. She did not drive to his office or demand an explanation. She sat at the kitchen table until the afternoon light moved off the floor, then called Dorian back. Find out how far this went, she said. The answer arrived in pieces. Graham had represented the lake house as part of their joint marital portfolio. He had listed projected equity from the property in a preliminary lender packet. He had also described Aaliyah as supportive of the transaction, though she had never seen the documents. Dorian advised immediate revocation of access and formal notice. Aaliyah agreed. Then she asked him to wait 48 hours before contacting the lender. She wanted the full record first. During those 2 days, Orson Pike, Graham's chief financial officer, sent Dorian a copy of the internal asset schedule. He had questioned the inclusion of Hartwell Lake House and received a direct instruction from Graham to leave it in. The email was brief. Aaliyah will sign when needed. She always does. That sentence hurt more than the hotel receipt. It reduced 17 years of accommodation to a financing assumption. It explained why Graham had come to the gate with luggage instead of concern. He had stopped seeing her consent as something that existed separately from his plans. Outside, Dorian parked behind the black sport utility vehicle and stepped out carrying a slim leather portfolio. Graham walked toward him before he reached the call box. You had no reason to come here, Graham said. Dorian closed the car door carefully. I was asked by the trustee to attend. This is between my wife and me. You informed her she was no longer your wife. Dorian's voice remained level. Maribel lowered her eyes. Graham looked toward the security camera, aware that Aaliyah could hear him. The appraisal was preliminary, he said. No funds have moved. Dorian opened the portfolio but did not remove anything yet. The lender received a property schedule containing a trust asset you do not own. It was a reference asset. Without authorization, Aaliyah would have approved it. Inside the house, Aaliyah closed her fingers around the brass key. There it was again. Not remorse. Expectation. Dorian looked directly at Graham. She did not. The words settled across the driveway. Maribel stepped away from the vehicle. You used this house for the resort loan? She asked. Graham turned toward her. That is not what happened. You told me the financing was complete. It will be. Dorian removed 1 page from the portfolio. Not under the current submission. Graham's face changed. Behind him, The lake had gone dark, and the windows of the house reflected against the iron bars. Aloan watched from the warmth he had assumed would always open for him, understanding that the affair had been only one betrayal. The larger one was written in a file where he had treated her name like a signature he already owned. Dorian held the single page between two fingers while the security light cast a pale circle across the gravel. Graham did not reach for it. He looked toward the house instead, as though Aloan might still step outside, apologize, and restore the version of the evening he had planned. She remained behind the glass, the brass key resting in her palm. The truth had not begun at the gate. It had begun 4 days earlier, when Dorian arrived at Hartwell Lake House with Tamsin Rowe and a locksmith from Geneva. Aloan had watched them move through the property without urgency. Every action was documented. Graham's electronic gate code was disabled. His remote was deactivated. The duplicate keys kept in his Manhattan office were listed as invalid. Tamsin changed the lock on the west study, where trust files and property records had been stored for years. The wine room, boathouse, guest wing, and service entrance were added to a new access system linked only to Aloan's phone and the trustee's account. Nothing was done in anger. Dorian read each authorization aloud before Aloan signed it. Tamsin photographed every room and created an inventory of furniture, artwork, equipment, and documents. "This protects the property," Dorian said while placing the final notice into an overnight envelope. "It also prevents him from claiming he was denied access without warning." Aloan had looked at the envelope addressed to Graham's office. "Send copies by email and certified mail. He may ignore them. Then the record will show that he chose not to read." That afternoon, she carried her mother's photograph from the study to the entry hall. For years, Graham's business awards had occupied the most visible shelf, though none of them belonged to the house. Aloan removed them one by one and placed them in labeled boxes. She did not damage anything. She did not throw away the framed magazine cover where Graham stood on the dock, smiling beneath a headline about self-made success. She simply packed it with the rest of his belongings and asked Tamsin to store everything in the detached carriage house until collection could be arranged. At sunset, Aloan walked the property alone. She checked the boathouse doors, closed the garden shed, and stood at the end of the dock while the lake darkened around her. The preparations felt less like retaliation than repair. She was returning each boundary to the place where it should have been. Graham had received the notice the next morning. The delivery service recorded his assistant's signature at 9:12. The email system confirmed it had been opened at 9:27. At 11, he forwarded the message to his personal account without responding. By noon, he had asked his driver to prepare the sport utility vehicle for the weekend. By 3, Maribel had posted a photograph of packed luggage beside white flowers. Graham had not misunderstood the notice. He had assumed Aloan would not enforce it. Now, outside the gate, Dorian turned the page so Graham could see the timestamp. "You opened this at 9:27 yesterday morning," he said. Graham's mouth tightened. "I intended to discuss it with Aloan in person. You arrived with a guest and luggage. My private life is irrelevant to property access. Your refusal to acknowledge the owner's instructions is relevant." Maribel looked at Graham with her arms folded close to her body. "You knew the gate code was canceled?" He glanced at her. "I knew Aloan was upset. That is not what I asked." The wind lifted a strand of her hair across her cheek. Graham did not answer. Inside, Aloan watched the distance growing between them. She felt no triumph, only the cold clarity of seeing a pattern without defending it. Graham had counted on access more than permission, habit more than law, and her silence more than her signature. Dorian returned the page to the portfolio. "The notice stands," he said. "Neither you nor your guest may enter without written consent from the trustee." Graham looked toward the locked gate, then at the warm windows beyond it. "Aloan will change her mind." She pressed the intercom once. "No," she said. The single word carried across the driveway. For the first time that evening, Graham had nothing ready to place over it. Graham stood beneath the security light with one hand still wrapped around the iron gate, his silence more revealing than any denial. Maribel watched him from beside the sport utility vehicle, the white flowers on the back seat visible through the open door. Dorian remained a few feet away, holding the leather portfolio against his coat. Inside the house, Aloan looked at the monitor and understood that the moment had finally become simple. There was the gate. There was the man who believed it would open because it always had. There was the woman he had brought to replace her before he had finished telling the truth. Aloan picked up the brass key and walked through the entry hall toward the front terrace. The cold air met her as soon as she opened the door. Gravel shifted beneath her shoes while she crossed the private drive, moving slowly enough that Graham could see she was not rushing to rescue him from the consequences of his choices. She stopped several yards inside the gate. The iron bars remained between them. Graham straightened. Finally, he said, "Tell Dorian, this has gone far enough." Aloan held the key loosely at her side. "It went too far when you listed this property without permission." Maribel turned toward him. Graham's jaw tightened. That document was preliminary. The lender received it. Nothing was funded. That does not make the representation true. He glanced toward Dorian, then back at Aloan. "You are embarrassing both of us over a technical mistake." The lake moved behind her in dark, quiet lines. Whose mistake? The finance team used an old property schedule. With my signature? Graham's eyes changed. Only slightly. It was enough. Maribel stepped away from the vehicle. "What signature?" she asked. Graham did not look at her. "Aloan, this is not the place for this conversation. You brought it to my gate." The words carried through the cold without effort. Graham moved closer to the bars. "I told you the marriage was over. I am allowed to move forward. You are allowed to leave." Aloan lifted the key just enough for the brass to catch the light. "You are not allowed to take what does not belong to you." Maribel's face had gone still. "You said she agreed to use the house for the financing." "She was going to," Graham replied. "That is not what you told me. This is complicated." Aloan looked at him through the gate. For 17 years, complication had been the word he used when truth threatened convenience. "Then answer one simple question," she said. "Why did you need my forged consent to list it?" The wind moved between the iron bars. Graham's mouth opened, but no explanation came. Maribel stared at him. Dorian lowered his portfolio and waited. Aloan felt no satisfaction in the silence. Only the clean weight of a boundary finally spoken aloud. Graham looked toward the house, toward the warm windows, the stone terrace, the dock beyond the trees. He had used every part of it to shape an image of success. Now the image stood behind Aloan, beyond his reach. "You know I would never steal from you," he said at last. "You already treated my consent as something you owned." His hand slipped from the gate. Maribel folded her arms tightly across her coat. "Did you sign her name?" she asked. Graham turned toward her. "No," the answer came too quickly. Dorian opened the portfolio. "Then you will have no objection to the lender reviewing the original authorization record." Graham's face hardened. "You contacted them?" Aloan met his eyes. "They contacted me after Dorian corrected the property file. You had no right to interfere with Silver Pines. You used my property to support it." The security light above the gate brightened as darkness settled over the road. Graham stood outside with his mistress, his luggage, and a financing deal built partly on permission he never had. Aloan remained inside with the key. The gate did not move. Dorian opened the portfolio and removed 3 documents, placing them against the flat stone cap beside the gate so the security light fell across each page. The first was the original Hartwell Trust certificate. The second was Graham's lender submission for Silver Pines. The third was the authorization record showing that Aloan had never approved the use of the lake house. Graham looked at the pages but did not reach for them. Maribel did. She stepped closer, reading the property description, then the ownership line beneath it. Hartwell Family Trust. Sole beneficiary, Aloan Hartwell. No marital interest conveyed. No borrowing authority granted to spouse. Her eyes moved to the next page, where the lake house appeared under Graham's claimed assets. "You said this belonged to you before the marriage," she said. Graham kept his attention on Dorian. "The trust structure is a technical distinction. It says you have no ownership. I have invested years in this property." Aloan stood several yards inside the gate, the brass key cool in her hand. "Years are not a deed," she said. Dorian turned to the final document. The lender's compliance officer requested confirmation of this signature. He pointed to the name written beside Aloan's typed authorization line. Even from where she stood, Aloan could see the familiar attempt to imitate her handwriting. The first letter was too narrow. The final stroke rose when hers always fell. Graham looked at it without expression. "I did not sign that." "Then someone submitted it on your behalf," Dorian said. "The review will determine who." Headlights appeared beyond the curve. A dark sedan stopped behind Dorian's car, and a woman in a navy coat stepped out carrying a slim file. She introduced herself through the gate speaker as Livia Dane, outside counsel for the Silver Pines lender. Graham's face lost the last trace of irritation and settled into calculation. "This is unnecessary," he said. "The property can simply be removed from the package." Livia remained outside the gate near Dorian. "The issue is not only the property. The issue is the accuracy of the entire asset schedule and whether other representations require verification." She opened her file. "Until that review is complete, underwriting is suspended." The words were quiet. Their effect was not. Graham looked toward Alohan. "You knew they were coming. I knew they had questions. You let me arrive here without warning." Alohan's gaze moved to the luggage, the flowers, and Maribel's pale coat. "You had written notice before you packed the car." Maribel stepped away from him. "You told me the financing was approved. It was moving forward. You told me we were celebrating the closing." Graham lowered his voice. "This is a temporary delay." Livia turned another page. "There is also an internal email directing the finance team to keep Hartwell Lake House in the schedule after ownership was questioned." Dorian looked at Graham. "The instruction came from your account." The cold air seemed to sharpen around the gate. Alohan did not move. She remembered the sentence from Orson Pike's email. "Alohan will sign when needed. She always does." Graham looked at the iron bars separating him from the house. "I expected my wife to support the project." "You expected her signature," Dorian replied, "without asking for it." Maribel closed her eyes briefly, then looked at Alohan through the gate. "Did you know about us before tonight?" Alohan answered honestly. "I knew enough." "And you still waited here?" "I waited for the documents to speak clearly." Graham turned toward Maribel. "Do not let her manipulate this." Maribel looked at the false authorization, then at the locked gate. "She is not the one who brought me here under a lie." No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Livia informed Graham that Silver Pines would remain suspended pending a full independent review. Dorian confirmed that the trust would preserve all records and cooperate. Then Alohan lifted the brass key slightly and looked at Graham through the bars. "You have no ownership, no access, and no authorization." His hand fell from the gate. Behind her, the lake house windows glowed across. The dark water. In front of him, every path he had treated as permanent had closed at once. The road remained quiet after Livia closed her file. Graham stood beside the locked gate with the autumn wind pressing his coat against him, while Maribel moved toward the passenger side of the vehicle without waiting for him. The flowers on the back seat had begun to lean against the glass. Dorian gathered the documents from the stone ledge and returned them to the leather portfolio. Alohan watched the three of them through the iron bars, the brass key still in her hand. She had imagined this moment differently during the sleepless nights after discovering the hotel receipt and the false authorization. In some versions, Graham apologized. In others, he finally understood what he had taken for granted. The real moment was quieter. He looked less like a man facing the end of a marriage than a man calculating which loss would cost him most. "You do realize what this will do to my company," he said. Alohan looked toward the dark lake behind him. "Your company is being reviewed because of documents you submitted. You could correct this privately." "I corrected the ownership record privately." The lender decided what followed. Graham's eyes shifted toward Dorian. "And the divorce?" Alohan held his gaze. "My attorney will contact yours Monday morning." Maribel stopped beside the open car door. For the first time that evening, Graham looked at her as though remembering she was there. "Get in," he said. She did not move. "Did you tell me the divorce was already filed?" she asked. Graham's expression tightened. "This is not the time." "Did you?" The silence answered before he did. Maribel lowered her head, then reached into the vehicle and removed only her handbag. She left the suitcase where it was. "I will arrange my own ride," she said. Graham called her name, but she walked toward Dorian's sedan and asked Livia whether there was a hotel nearby. Alohan felt no alliance with her. Maribel had entered the marriage knowing enough to cause harm. But she had also been given a false version of the house, the divorce, and the financing. The gate had not chosen sides. It had simply exposed who had been telling the truth. Graham looked back at Alohan. "You are enjoying this." She studied him for a moment. "No, I am ending it." He stepped away from the gate. Without his hand on the iron, he appeared smaller beneath the security light. Dorian informed him that arrangements would be made for the collection of his stored belongings from the carriage house. Until then, the property remained closed to him. Graham returned to the vehicle alone. The engine started, headlights swept across the trees, and the sport utility vehicle reversed slowly down the private road. The red keypad light remained unchanged. Aloan watched until the taillights disappeared beyond the bend. Then she turned back toward the house. The divorce took 7 months. The independent review found that Graham had directed his finance team to list Hartwell Lake House despite being warned that he lacked ownership. Silver Pines lost its original lender, and Graham's board placed the project under outside supervision. Aloan did not seek his company or his income. She removed her name, her property, and her responsibility from every agreement connected to him. Maribel provided emails confirming what Graham had promised her and how he had described the house. Afterward, she disappeared from both their lives. 1 year later, spring returned to Seneca Lake. Aloan stood at the same gate while Briar, Tamsin, and 6 women arrived for the first weekend of a new retreat program for those rebuilding after betrayal and divorce. The maples were green again. The lake carried sunlight instead of gray. Aloan entered a new code into the keypad and opened the gate. Cars moved slowly up the drive as laughter reached the house. Before following them, she paused beside the stone pillar and looked at the old brass key in her hand. Graham's code no longer existed in the system. His name no longer appeared on any access list. The house had not changed owners. Aloan had simply remembered that it already had one. He had mistaken an open door for ownership. She finally remembered that kindness was never permission.